Good evening, everyone. Welcome. So thrilled to see you all here tonight on this beautiful evening. My name is Shalini Lagal. I am the Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs here at the PMA, and I am so honored to welcome you all tonight to the Nelson Social Justice Fund Lecture. You too. I would first like to acknowledge that we are convening tonight's celebration in the land of the Dawn, a region encompassing present-day Maine and the unceded homelands of the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, and Abenaki nations. Together, these nations represent the Wabanaki Confederacy. They have stewarded these lands and waters for thousands of years before the establishment of national borders and state lines, and continue to do so today. The Leonard and Merle Nelson Social Justice Fund, established in 1999, honors artists whose commitment to social justice is manifested in their work and lives. Thank you, Leonard and Merle Nelson, for being here tonight and for your vision to establish this fund so many years ago. Through this fund, the museum is able to welcome artists and cultural leaders as featured lecturers, including Jeremy Frey, Jenny Holzer, David Driscoll, Jeffrey Gibson, and Ahmed Al-Sudani. Many of these artists are also represented in the PMA collection, and we're thrilled to announce that a work by Alfredo Yar, who is also a former Nelson Social Justice Fund lecturer, was just acquired by the PMA through the generosity of several supporters this spring who remembered the lecture that Yar gave many years ago. The establishment of this fund reveals the extraordinary foresight of Merle and Lenny. It is also a testament to their personal and professional commitment to social justice and their support of cultural figures who are social justice champions. And tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome Chase Hall in conversation with Sayantan Mukhopadhyay, Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the PMA. Chase is a multidisciplinary artist who explores race, identity, and history through narratives of power, earning him recognition as a critical voice in American contemporary art today. His distinctive paintings, using unprimed cotton canvas and coffee stains, reflect his mixed-race experience in America, blending symbolism and storytelling. Hall has completed residencies at Skowhegan and MassMocha and had his first museum solo exhibition at the SCAD, Savannah College of Art and Design Museum of Art in Savannah, Georgia in 2023. He is also featured in Painting Energy, Gifts from the Alex Katz Foundation at the PMA, which is on view right upstairs. Please join me in welcoming Chase and Sayantan.
Thank you so much, Shalini, for that really wonderful introduction. Thank you all for being here tonight, and most importantly, thank you, Chase, for being here.
Thank you.
I'd love to start off by talking about the work that's probably the easiest entry point for a lot of our visitors here today. A lot of you, I hope, have been upstairs to see Painting Energy. That features a work by Chase. And I was wondering whether you might be able to talk us through this particular painting, sculpture, somewhere in between.
Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited about this conversation with Sayantan, and I'm honored to be part of the collection and the show. And thank you guys for coming out and spending your Friday with me, and thank you to the Nelsons for the opportunity here. This piece was titled Respite Grapes. It's of a grape worker kind of sitting under the shade of these dish towels. To me, I was really interested in how at moments throughout your day you find respite. So those kind of water breaks or smoke breaks or bathroom breaks, those kind of moments where you take time for yourself to kind of gather a little bit of stamina, courage even. So for this piece, it was juxtaposing these tea towels that I used as a way to gather paint off of brushes from previous paintings. And the collection of tea towels in this piece were from about 4 years. And I was always trying to conserve paint, not waste it. So I would make these little marks on the tea towel after making paintings. And I would hang it from this clothes drying rack as this way to incorporate some of the found object. Often me and my wife would go to thrift stores or estate sales. Now my daughter, who you hear in the back, she'll come with us. So you'd find these objects, and I was always trying to construct these kind of questions in my work, and I found that I could use the drying rack as this way to kind of have a trompe-l'oeil usage of the tea towels drying, but also through that work, through the history of the paint on those towels and the history of the towels within themselves, they act as a shade. They act as a moment where you can't see the face. There's a bit of refusal there, and I was really interested in how the wood grain panel is also another natural material. So as you guys heard briefly, I often work with coffee and cotton, and this piece was one of the few pieces I used wood as a backing as well to kind of have one more natural material in that kind of triangulation of natural alternative materials in the painting space. So there's a mix of painting, sculpture, and my love for assemblage and kind of ad hoc usage that I tried to infuse into this piece. And this piece means a lot to me because it's something we were saying earlier in the tour or our walkthrough. You often make things and you aren't positive how they'll show up or how they'll make you feel or how you kind of come to it. And I found this piece was something that was a little bit ahead of where I was at the time, and now visiting it again 3-4 years later, it's still somewhere that I plan to go. So it's a nice reminder of how you can infuse these different tactile moments, things you see in the world, and actually bring them into your painting, but also these ideas that I'm kind of thinking about in my work constantly.
I love you talking about the refusal of seeing the face in this work, and in some of the words that are out there about your practice, I noticed that word refusal comes up quite often. In most of your work, you work on this unprimed canvas where you leave a lot of the canvas showing, and I know you've talked about that as a kind of moment of refusal too. Some of the examples of which we're seeing here. Could you talk a little bit about that, the leaving parts unmarked as a kind of refusal?
Yeah, I think for me, I got into painting out of this kind of extension of my film photography practice when I first moved to New York in 2014. I was always drawing and doodling, but I would go around and see so much art. And I was always drawn to the ways in which abstraction or minimalism would kind of leave me with questions, like the classic, like, my kid could do that, and like, how is this genius? And I was always kind of questioning, like, who has the audacity or who's allowed to paint with nothing in a way, who can leave so much of this open. So for me, that kind of refusal is this idea of like taking space or kind of underperforming, this idea that the application of paint creates a mark, but the cotton canvas actually acts as a palindrome when you're making the mark. So there's this kind of application and counter that you're constantly kind of finding a balance within. So in that kind of biraciality of blackness as this archetype, this figure, the story, the narrative, and then whiteness in relationship to cotton in American history as this kind of counteraction. So in that kind of genetic humility, in the confusion of blackness and whiteness existing in one space, I was trying to negotiate how that history is an oppositional gaze, and so are the figures, and so is the eye line. And that history exists within all of us, and it exists within that kind of tension and that hybridity specifically. So the refusal is this kind of, this way to think about that kind of minimalism history in relationship to the Pollocks and Clifford Still and Alma Thomas, Lee Krasner. And then with the figure, I'm thinking a lot about Kerry James Marshall, Henry Taylor, Charles White, Romari Bearden. And in that kind of blackness and whiteness canonical history, what does it look like to actually see that cross-pollination in my work? And of course, moments where I'm infusing my own kind of addition into that, but it really started from this kind of question of like, who could leave negative space and how can abstraction exist? So I'm often thinking about the palindrome, race car spelled both ways, is spelling race car, mom, this idea of the zebra with black stripes or a zebra with white stripes, and this kind of constant accordion. There's this times where you're expanding and times where you're contracting. And I find that in authoring my work, I was trying to build bridges between these areas instead of existing in the polarizing language that we all know more colloquially. So that kind of confusion, that application and refusal is similarly to my own experience. You know, there's this kind of internal racial mosaic where as you grow, you're almost putting a tile somewhere or you're removing a thorn, and this kind of tile versus the thorn is something I think about a lot. So there's this idea that there's room to grow, there's constant conversations that are expanding through the work internally and in spaces like this. And for me, it was that notion of, you know, when you pull the thorn out and you re-examine it, what do you gather from realizing when it kind of stuck you? And when you put the tile in as this kind of like relationship to the movie Inside Out, like there are these marbles that stick so succinctly in your life, and they're good and bad marbles, so that kind of tile and thorn notion, the application and the minimalism, they're just these points, kind of canyons and valleys, or peaks and valleys of experience and composition.
I love your characterization of the American experience as something more like a mosaic. I think we hear melting pot a lot, but that, I don't know if it's a very fair assessment. Mosaic kind of keeps the tension, right? It keeps things abutting against one another. I guess my next question would be, we've talked about the nature of unprimed canvas and the way that that speaks to your own experience as a racialized subject. Could you speak a little bit about coffee and your use of coffee in your work?
Yeah, I started working with coffee when I would work at Starbucks in high school. So I would always, I was always drawing. I loved doodling and making little faces, and I would make these faces when people weren't there on receipts and make marks. And I would, think of like almost like an ink and a quill. I had the espresso, and I would almost like mark make on the receipts with these drawings. So I think that kind of idea of alternative material started at a very young age, and I just kept kind of chasing that rabbit of alternative material. I think through developing that relationship to coffee, it really was just innate. Like it felt like a color that I could use that was right in front of me. And I think as I continued to see it kind of fragment in front of me and I started to pull it apart, I started to see conceptual relationships to it. And at that time, when I was really getting into art, I saw so many artists using different objects to tell different stories. So, thinking of Betty Saar and the clock or the ship, and Mark Bradford and the paper, and Theaster Gates and the tar, and David Hammonds and barbershop clippings, I was so drawn to this idea that painting and art and creativity existed outside of the art store. It existed outside of art schools, and how could this kind of detritus or debris that I found drawn to making my street photography actually enter the studio as this kind of melting pot, this cauldron. So if I was using all these different materials, I could start to think about, these similar trade lines of spices and sugar and coffee, transatlantic slave trade, and the relationship that black coffee had when I would work at Starbucks, and there would be these little microaggressions of like, can I have my coffee black? I'm sorry, just no, and I'm like, no, like it's okay, like I understand. So there was this constant reiteration of how coffee and blackness and coffee from Ethiopia or Africa would have this kind of swirling thought. So for me, so much of the art that I'm thinking about and the questions I have in my project are kind of making space for a younger self, trying to understand some of those thorns I had mentioned and reappropriate how those thorns were actually experiences that helped me learn more about the American landscape and the human condition. And I found that coffee was this relationship to blackness, the ways that people drink coffee for energy and this kind of constant demand, this relationship to the penny university. You go to a coffee shop, you hear music, you hear poetry. It's a place where you have deep conversation. There's often newspapers around, and for a few bucks, I guess now more than a few bucks, you can still be engaged and be in these spaces. So it was this kind of third language in a way. It just felt like a really natural way to extend some of my questions and extend ways that I could refuse the art store, but also kind of build compositions in alternative ways.
This is a very granular question, but how exactly do you control the kind of color with coffee?
Yeah, so I've been able to develop about 26 different tones of brown out of a single coffee bean. And every coffee bean is varied depending on the geography and the type of roast. So for me, to answer it simply, a coarse ground coffee will give you a light brown, a fine ground coffee will give you a dark brown. So there's times where I'll use different techniques from like a Chemex or a filter coffee with very coarse grounds, or there's times where I'll use like a Turkish ground, or like a very dusty, very fine grained coffee in an espresso machine, and you almost like choke out the machine where it's like coughing out bits of coffee. Every painting yields about 10 to 150 shots of espresso. It's so not funny to me. It's kind of, it's even like, people are like, do you still drink coffee? Or like, do your paintings smell? And it's like, yeah, when they're wet, they do smell, and I still do drink coffee. But a lot of that kind of alchemy is something that just really drives me. It's this kind of fortune teller in relationship to even the way turkey reading has been a part of fortune telling. But I'm really drawn to the ways that coffee can actually show me things I don't know. When you're using a heavy-bodied acrylic, it wants to behave for the brush inherently. When you're using a boiling liquid that's not made for paint, it wants to run directly off the canvas. So these are done, 5 to 9 layers of boiling liquid. The white space obviously has had nothing touch it, so this is like a mad dash around the painting, often done flat, and it all has to be done at a time where everything is still wet, so there's no kind of incongruencies of how the tones dry, and it actually creates this interesting ventriloquism because I have to respond to what it's doing, but I also have to direct it in the ways in which that hidden language that exists in the coffee space or in that negative space is that kind of palindrome that I had spoken about before. There's times where the coffee kind of shows me what's coming, and there are times where I'm trying to just make sure that everything's happening all together all at once. I have, mason jars of 1 to 26, and I make a little tonal chart every day when I'm painting to see what numbers are drying in which ways. And I navigate those decisions similarly to film photography once again, where that's like my light meter. If you look at the kind of, you bend your arm and you see the darkness in the pleats of your shirt, it's because no light is touching it. Whereas in the top of where you're making that bend, there's the most light. Similarly to like the tip of our nose is going to be the brightest, but the vignetting of our ears is because there's less light. So I'm constantly trying to develop the ways in which I'm building composition similarly to the light meter, but also negotiating that kind of material as a way to, have a sort of refusal, have this idea that everything is involved in the painting. So it's this kind of maddening alchemy that I've been developing. Recently, I've been able to actually use it on paper, develop different putties and pigments, inks, paints, literally watercolors, even like charcoal pencils. So there's been a lot of developments since being 14 at Starbucks, but there's definitely still a long way to go. So it's an interesting way to see alternative material, just recently mixing it in concrete, seeing it in a sculptural form, patinizing bronze with coffee. So really letting it being a driving force for the question, but also the application and the composition.
In my time working at collecting institutions, I've become more hyper aware of kind of conservation, and I was really pleased to find out from our registrars that coffee as a pigment is actually a very stable material. So there was no concerns about coffee and its longevity. And as soon as something comes through our doors, I'm always like, oh my gosh, what's going to stop me from being able to show it all the time? And in this case, it's not the coffee; it's the fact that there's textile. But that's a different conversation.
Yeah, I think to your point there, it's an interesting consideration that this notion of forever actually gets in the way of what we do constantly, even outside of the art space. I think this idea that things have to last 10,000 years, it's like, let's worry about tomorrow and the next day and maybe the next year. But I think the notion of forever gets in the way of invention. It gets in the way of experimentation. And, I was happy to find that out as well. I spent a lot of time researching and navigating how coffee's been used throughout history. Funny enough, Thornton Dial and Clifford Still are two artists that I think about that also have used coffee, I found out recently, as well as the Harvard Museum has one of the works, and I was speaking with their conservator, and they had shown me old manuscripts of early painters from the 1500s, 1600s that were also using coffee. So it's this interesting nonlinear timeline, and this audacity and this kind of belief that color exists all around us, and how can you make it beautiful? How can you look at a cochineal beetle and make a red pigment? Or how can you break down flowers and see purples you can't find other places? And how can this brownness that we see in so many different tones actually be representations of brownness we see all over? So it is, from institutional support, we've been able to do a lot of tests and find really exciting results, as well as ways to mitigate it. I use a watercolor base. There's bits of glycerin, honey, that break down bacteria, and in the paint work, or in the paper works, I use an etching medium, which has a lot of alcohol and things that kill some of the concerns and also create a longevity. For me, painting in the studio is almost this sponge where my whole life kind of goes into it, and all of my interests and questions, and you kind of wring it out. And in wringing it out, the painting is kind of the result of that. So for me, science, humanity, psychology, beauty, texture, alternative realities, those all triangulate and swirl into the things and the decisions and the questions and the work. So to have the receipts be able to share stories and actually catalyze conversations like this and find different ways to use things, I think is necessary across the board. And I'm just thankful that my work brings me closer to that potential invention, that potential alternative future.
You've touched on this maybe in a slanted fashion about there's an incredible kind of intermediality in your work. You've come from film. In the work that's now part of our collection, there's a deeply sculptural element, and you've also worked in sculpture before. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship to medium and how that's developed over time?
Yeah, I think, to pinpoint the word of the talk, refusal, I didn't go to college. I found art by being attracted to things. I found answers and questions through asking them and going closer to them. And I never wanted to close off what my questions could be based on how they showed up. Meaning I believe in an artist as a thinker and a questioner, and more of a cultural scientist than a perfectionist or a technical perfectionist. So for me, when there are motifs and symbols and themes that cross so many borders and so many genres, I was really interested in how things I see in movies or music or in daily encounters or in photography or in cooking, the same Maillard theory of browning butter or the mirepoix of an onion, celery, and carrots, those are the same slippages in cooking and displacement of nitrogen that creates the roast of a coffee bean, that turns it from a green bean into a crackling brown bean. All of these things are so related. We all are wearing clothes that are derived from cotton or different materials, and that relationship to a history and that relationship to the backing of nearly every canvas that has a painting on it. The ways that we are all kind of falling into each other or collapsing into each other is so obvious to me. So I didn't want to kind of have this secular, individual way where I only can do this and talk about it in this way, because I was making something for me. I was experimenting and questioning because I believed in it. So I didn't ever have much discipline with a single mom. She was kind of like, brush your teeth and don't fuck up. And because of that, I think I was able to make bad habits and just build language for it. I think that there is an anti-formalism that creates newness and creates inventive potential. And I teach at NYU, and a lot of what I share with my students is that don't let this bracketing system that exists so obviously around the world bracket you and your beliefs and your interests. So it was this kind of taking up space, but also breaking down the walls that came with that space, or not breaking down, but pushing back, making space for yourself and your creativity. And this multi-hyphenate or kind of multimedia thing is just not telling yourself no, but just going closer to the thing that strikes you.
We're so deeply willing to kind of put boundaries on ourselves, and what happens when you can break apart from that, what happens when you can allow yourself to explore more than one avenue. I wanted to ask you about, so a lot of your painting practice is figurative, and I think we have a very special work in which the face is occluded. That's not always the case. There are oftentimes kind of faced subjects in your work. And I was very curious to know, what are these people in the real world? Sometimes it's somebody, you know, it's a character that we know, but where do you get your people from for your figurative work, for your portraits?
Yeah, I think back to photography, I would walk, you know, about 10 miles every day, and I would see so many faces. I grew up, I lived in about 8 different states. I went to almost 10 different schools, all before I was 20. I grew up a single child and an only child with a single mom. And I think this relationship to masculinity, blackness, humanity, fitting in, assimilation, these were all safety mechanisms for me. They were always like, oh, look, that person's upset. How can I disarm them with a smile and say, hey, nice shirt, or like, you look great, I hope you have a good day. Like, it was out of safety. You know, I wore a shirt with a collar because I didn't want someone to assume the worst of me. I showed up in a way looking someone in the eyes because a scene from Remember the Titans told me, you know, it's like all of the ways that the world influences who you are and how you show up and what you wear. These are all decisions. And I find that through seeing so many people and always considering someone else and that kind of eye line I had mentioned previously, these are things that I would see when I would close my eyes. These were people that I saw, you know, you make images all day and you're using the camera as a tool to articulate what you care about, what you think about, and how you see people in style. And then when you're at home in that kind of isolated space, you're like, all right, you know, you can kind of imagine, you know, like the top 10 people of your experience that day. And I didn't want this to be a relationship to an actual individual. I was more drawn to the archetype. I was drawn to, you know, mother and child. I was drawn to the wanderer. I was drawn to the outsider or the alpha. I was drawn to these notions of people that we know. You know, we all have a funny uncle. We all have a strict grandmother. We all have these shared experiences. And how can the archetype hold a relationship to humanity that we can all share? And in that sharing of humanity, how can we understand or maybe analyze the human condition? So those relationships to the subject are people that I see or people that I imagine, but they're not representational of an exact person. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying I'm more interested in the posturing or the composition, but we all look so different, but we all have eyes, nose, and mouths just millimeters apart from each other. So I'm really drawn to the fact that, you know, these kind of anchors of the human body are so similar, but yet they can change just by the smallest exchange. So if I build the posture in relationship to the composition, I know where eyes, nose, and mouth would go. I know where a shirt would go on the torso. So I just keep it simple in that way, and sometimes it has a doppelganger effect, which I love. Someone will be like, that looks like my Uncle Ricky. I'm like, awesome. How's Uncle Ricky doing? Like there's more of this feeling of like a connection and a reciprocity that I'm drawn to than this idea of perfection. And it's like, you know, trying to paint someone you know can be hard because they never like what they look like. So there's also this freedom in saying, oh, this is someone that does this, and he would eat this, and he would hang out with these people, and he wore this because he's drawn to this. So you can imagine a future, you can imagine a person, and that gives me a lot of freedom when creating because I don't have to demarcate their specificity.
But you know, I've had the luck of seeing many of your works in a room together. I was at your last solo show at David Grodzinski in New York, and you have this amazing gift to, even in that anonymity, create a kind of monumentality. These figures take up so much space and have so much presence, which is, I think, a very difficult thing to do if these are people who are you know, they're not drawn directly, exactly from a single person. So it's really kind of in awe of your ability to kind of do that, and especially when many of your works populate a room, that kind of encounter is extremely powerful for a viewer. So
I really appreciate that. I think, it's this feeling of when you give something so much, hopefully it can extend that spirit within it. I believe in the things I'm thinking about, and I believe in the work I'm doing, and if that can congeal and dry up in the paint and someone stands in front of it and they feel a spirit, that's because I gave it so much and it showed me so much in that process of giving. So, I relate that to seeing the most out of people, meeting people, traveling a lot, nomadic experiences, seeing highs and lows of the world, and being down bad and being shitting in high cotton. It's like there's times where life is really special and bright, and there are times where it's really tough and dark, and encapsulating all of that in relationship to people and subjectivity is something I'm really thankful for. And I think that it's closer to a song. It's like you're singing about someone and when you hear Beautiful Boy and you think about a beautiful child in your life, those are just themes and symbols of what that means to you. So I think, I really appreciate that, because I think at the most rudimentary kind of common denominator of what I'm trying to do is share feeling and emotion and that belief in one another. So I'm really happy to hear that you feel that too. But yeah, they're definitely people to me, without them being specific people.
We're in Portland, Maine now, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about something that tied you to Maine before this moment, which was your time at Skowhegan. We are very, very proud of the kind of number and the breadth of artist residencies that are present in the state. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your experiences at Skowhegan and what that experience might have taught you.
Yeah, for me, as I mentioned, being self-taught, residencies have been this alternative space where you can have a sense of formal, kind of serious engagement with other artists or educators, in spaces that allow you to, it's like, wow, I'm so drawn to the varnish of this wood and the way that these different grains are going in certain directions. And someone at the residency is like, me too, holy shit. Like, I thought I was, it's like in the real world, people are like, yeah, that's a stage, man. So like, what are you doing? And you're like, okay, so there's this space where those types of kind of, different people can exist in a place and share their deep love for something. So I think residencies in general were a place for critique, communication, artistry to explore and expand, and realize those individual interests I had weren't actually as individual. They were just not allowed to exist in some of the more kind of staunchly get on with it spaces. And Skowhegan specifically was incredible because it's about 3 months. You really get to know the people around you. It's 60 people. You spend about 90 days going to different classes, different critiques, open studios, and people from 19 years old to 50 years old. And there's 4 resident artists, teachers, and then 4 visiting. So every few weeks you have a different artist come, and then you have your kind of main artist that you're, no pun intended, the person that you're really going deep with. And I think during that time, it was really important to see how other artists make art, how other artists make breakfast, how other artists work. Some people work at night, some people work in the day, some people don't work at all. All of that existing in one space was just another education. So for me, the history of Skowhegan speaks for itself. So many great thinkers since the 40s have gone through it. And I knew, my wife was studying at Parsons painting and sculpture, and she told me about it back in 2014. And I applied a few times and I didn't get in, and I finally got in. And I remember being so proud because I was like, wow, Lauren really cared about Skowhegan, and like through learning about it, now I'm really interested in. Now I get to see, what it's like. So, a few of my dearest friends I have till this day I met there, and it's kind of like the WASPy Eastern summer camp that people go to, but for artists. Like, I know a few friends, like, I went to this camp, and like they still wear their sweater. So for me, it's a mix of my WASPy camp, but also my college education, kind of hyper accelerated in a place where, there's like 4 people in one room, and there's 4 rooms in the house, and there's people from all over the world that are, trying to use the same shower. So it's just like, it's a mess, but it's incredible. And I'm totally for residencies. I think any place you can go to really take your work serious and build conversation with people that also take their work serious is an incredible thing. But yeah, I was totally blown away by my time there, and was incredibly pivotal in my thinking. And having critiques for the first time was really nice. Like recognizing that someone who cares will kind of keep you sharp. It's like a steel sharpening steel idea. Like, your friends who don't care, like, this is amazing, great painting. And then it's like, oh, cool, I guess I'm doing it all right. And then it's like, you have a critique, and it's like, what's your relationship to that? You're like, oh shit, like, I'm not sure actually. So now, being in the teaching space, I take so many kind of moments from those questions, and that kind of the notion of close looking. Like, what do you love about the wood grain? Where did it come from? What type of tree is it? What color is it to you? Okay, so like you start to just peel back the onion in a way, and I'm really thankful for the teachers and spaces and people that support alternative spaces for education, because as much as it is a formal education, it's also incredibly informal. So those spaces where you pick up things, like a museum, there are these spaces where things stick with you, and you go further through what you learn and through what you pick up.
Well, I hope they gave you a Camp Skowhegan sweatshirt to wear around to match everyone else's camp sweatshirts. I lastly wanted to ask you about any upcoming projects that you might be willing to share with us, or what's kind of on the horizon or on the docket where people can catch you around and catch your work around.
Yeah, I think coming up, there's a few group show things, shows that are up or coming up in different institutions that have the work, or different. I have a show up in Vienna right now with Ava Prestonhuber Gallery. It's pretty far, but if you go to Europe this summer, maybe you can see it. And then really spending a lot of time just with the family. I have a 1-year-old. I just moved my studio upstate New York, and been working a lot in different different mediums up there, and trying to organize and try and kind of make sure everything I'm doing has a space. So some ceramics and some sculpture, painting, getting spaces for photography to develop. So in a way, it's almost like between just opening the show in Europe and looking down, the next 6 months, really just a time for myself and my family, and organization and experimentation. I think, it's been a very hyper visible and hyper accelerated last 5 years for me, and I think looking into the next few months, really just taking time to get lost in the studio, to try new things, what happens if I burn coffee with a Bunsen burner for a whole day, and I take the charcoal and I smear it on just doing things for me and my own questions, instead of feeling like you're on that kind of treadmill of what's coming up and what's next. There's a project I have with Creative Capital. I'm working on a public sculpture in Los Angeles, which I'm excited about. And then there's some things kind of in the works. But yeah, really the next few months, just taking time to enjoy summer, try and fish, hike, relax, take care of the baby, and do things for the soul and for the spirit.
Just as important, if not more so. And I'm looking forward to seeing what this move upstate and this new studio experience might yield for you. I know of a lot of people here in Maine who have had analogous kind of moves from the city into a more kind of rural space, and I think that's generated lots of new directions for them. So I'm looking forward to seeing where that leads for you. Thank you so much, Chase. I'd really like to take the opportunity to open up the floor to questions from the audience. And so I welcome anyone to please use the microphones on either side of the room and come up and ask any questions they might have. Oh, please, Jorge. You have to, yeah. Right there, right next to you, yeah.
Hey, so I know that you mentioned Kerry James Marshall as one of the artists that you like, and I noticed in the slideshow there were many scenes of what would traditionally be thought of as white pastimes, which is something that Kerry Marshall did a lot of, right? Showing picnicking and water skiing and high jumpers and things like that. Are you doing some of that same sort of confrontation or that sort of challenge of what is a white activity, what is a black activity?
Yeah, 100%. You know, in the states that I mentioned, I had moved from Minnesota, Colorado, Las Vegas, California, New York. Oftentimes in those assimilation moments I had mentioned, it's like, oh, we're gonna go surf. And you're like, okay, like I'm gonna go surf today. My friend who lived in Arizona, he's like, you wanna go wake skating at Parker, Arizona, and like go behind the boat? And you're like, well, I went on a boat fishing in Minnesota, so like I'd love to go on a boat and learn how to wake skate. And you know, it's like there are these times through my own upbringing that I've had to assimilate and be in those spaces, whether it's playing golf, playing tennis. These things that would be confronted with, like, why do you want to be white? Or like,
Right.
Black people can't swim. Or like, does your hair get wet? Like, you don't need sunscreen. You know, these things that would be like super kind of micro traumas in that, you know, 11-year-old, 14-year-old body. So I think for me, back to building language for a younger self, a lot of that is kind of a seeing to believe. A lot of that notion that Kerry also used is like building a history that you want to be a part of. Seeing a nonlinear time travel notion to kind of see a history that you existed in. So the 13-year-old in the museum today can say, oh wow, like look, that's a black water skier. You know, it's like as simple as it is to imagine yourself, it does something to the psyche. You know, I would always think about, you know, you have the blonde-haired, blue-eyed knight fighting the dragon in all of these animation movies, and watching that as a young black kid, you're like, damn, like what? Where am I at? You know, and
Right.
Oftentimes where you see where you're at are in these tropes that are even represented in the tea towels here today, or in some of the cartoons that are kind of more slapstick or in relationship to a dehumanization tactic. So to your point, you know, these white passing spaces are actually areas of leisure, areas of sport, being by the water, thinking about the bathers, a lot of notions of just existing and seeing yourself in something outside of just performance or like climactic moments of like overcoming something. You know, I was interested in what does it mean to just be with your friends outside or toss the frisbee. So yeah, there's a simplicity, but also in a way it becomes radical to see ourselves outside of just, you know, rap music or basketball.
Well,
And
one thing that I picked up that's very different, you know, Kerry James Marshall's stuff is very confrontational. I mean, there's that gaze that is right looking at the viewer, right, and sort of daring you to challenge this. And in here, a lot of these scenes, there's a tremendous sense of joy in them, right? Like you're just having fun.
Yeah, I think that I articulate that a lot in like the knees or the knuckles, the nose, the hair, and the mouth. These areas that I leave white as that kind of mirroring, you know, literally the term white knuckling, right? Like in these spaces, they'd be like, what, you know, you can't swim. You're like, what? Like you kind of have to like grin and bear it. So for me, it's that disarming thing I had mentioned. Like I'm really good at the poker face of when things come up and you kind of just have to go through it. So you're not the angry black guy.
Yeah.
You know, there's this kind of like water on the duck's back as a kind of mechanism that I'm interested in. So that kind of contrary, melancholic, like how you feel inside or that internal reckoning, I think shows up in the abstraction of the work, in those negative spaces where you start to see haunting kind of glitches or faces or teeth or initials. So there's this walking on the shoulders of giants, right? Like blackness today is very different than what Kerry's working out in some of those motifs at his time, and in different spaces. So, you know, being the blonde dreadhead surfer kid is a very different experience than Chicago and spaces like that at that time. So I think there are moments in those spaces that I did really enjoy, and I think that there are moments in those spaces that were really confusing. So that kind of dichotomy was really important to me. But I had mentioned just like making your mark and building the language for it. I think about the work really just as like a handwriting. Like these are how they look because it just came out that way. I don't really try and make the like satirical joy that some people operate in. It just, there's a kind of stoicness or a stoicism, I think, in just existing in the world and trying to exist in all the complexities that we share, but still finding a belief that tomorrow is a blessing. Tomorrow is a special opportunity to keep doing the things you love. But I appreciate your question, and I too think there's definitely relationships but differences between there.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
The you don't need sunscreen thing is really real. It's like I also have skin, so yeah, that's a real one. Yeah, I get that a lot.
Thank you. Mr. Hall, thank you very much for being here. My question is, and it's short. You said twice, not once, you said twice that you didn't go to college, but you are remarkably well-read. How did you do it?
By not reading. No, I was someone who wanted to be able to articulate what I was dealing with internally to people and to others. So I think oftentimes I would use, a little saying I say to myself is like, use the internet for good. Look up, if it's Kerry James Marshall, where did he go to school, and what residencies did he do, and what curators did he work with, and what galleries did he show with, and what museums have the work, and what's the language, and what does that word mean? And then I watched the talk, and then in that talk, Kerry actually mentions Charles White. Okay, Charles White actually was a teacher of David Hammons, and David Hammons taught me that. So for me, it was this kind of reverse engineering. I was really interested in how there's endless information, whether you go to the library, you go online, you put yourself in the room, especially being in New York City. It's like I would go to a talk or an opening or a studio visit or ask questions or just analyze things. But I appreciate you saying that. But for me, it really was just like a curiosity. I wanted to get closer and closer to the specificity that was necessary to share what I was dealing with. And in doing so, I had to find the correct language or theory or opportunity to find someone kind of doing that work in their own way, and then also finding a way to bring it back home to me and find a way to do it in my way. But yeah, I think because of many different schools, different jobs, different class structures, and different negotiating different spaces, there was a lot of kind of eyes and ears to the wall and always kind of having my head on a swivel. I think through that questioning or agitation, it was kind of like I said it earlier today, but there's no progress in pleasure. So if you're in these areas of question, you're picking up so much information constantly. So yeah, I think just loving art making, loving creativity, loving language, and finding ways to learn and stay curious.
Hey there. Can you hear me? Is this working? All right. I wanted to thank the Nelsons first for putting this on. This is, there aren't enough of you who are putting money towards such wonderful things, and thank you for everything you mentioned. I started out, well, I guess I'd always been an artist, but I did go to college, and that created a whole problem where I wound up with jobs, so I quit a career, lived in New York for 24 years, and am now switching back. And I was doing pottery, and the wheel is so constricted, and so it feels like I started getting interested in hand building, but I see all of the things that you've done with bronze and concrete and all these things, and I was wondering, have you just been going around asking people how to how to make these things? Have you been taking classes? Like, I love wood, but I don't know how to use it. Like, I don't have the right tools. Or is it going to these residencies? And how are you? You were just asked about your, being an autodidact. Like, there are certain things that you can't just mess around with. You've got to have someone teach you. So how did you come by those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way I did just mess around with them. I mean, of course, bronze, you need a foundry and someone to kind of rope you into that. Printmaking, similarly, if you don't have the facilities, like how are you gonna etch copper and have, like, you need these spaces. So for me, it was just like, I started in photography because it was me being in the world and I had my camera. And then I was making drawings because I wasn't the most scholarly, so I would make my doodles. And then I would start making assemblage sculpture because there's trash everywhere and I could put it in a pyramid and call it art. And then I started to make paintings because I was able to use discarded stretcher bars and paint in dumpsters around colleges in New York. And then I would start to use my money working as a line cook to then go buy different stretcher bars and paint. But it was just this constant, like, brick by brick by brick thing. And it was this necessity. I think for me, I was so kind of headstrong on figuring out how can creativity be a tool to talk about what I care about. And how could I get closer to it? And through that kind of brick by brick notion, there was an older artist or a teacher or someone interested in the work was like, would you like to, come to the print studio with me and see how we do? And I'd be like, oh yeah, definitely, like, let's do it. So it was a mix of just like being a self-starter and just like taking up the space and doing it, and then also being really curious and like following up with that person a few weeks later and being like, hey, you said we were gonna go to the print studio, like, I'm ready to go. So I think a lot of that comes from, the surf and skate culture of like, you see the older guy doing the thing and you're like the loser with your pads on and your helmet and you're like, holy shit, how did you do that? Like, just being in amazement of things that you liked. And then also, once again, just like YouTube University, like on the internet, like how to make a birdhouse out of wood. And then you're like, well, look, this guy did it. Like, okay. So not trying to judge yourself in the process was really important, but just trying to do it. And recognizing, back to the minimalism and the abstraction, it's like, I know how to spill paint on the canvas and this is considered genius. So like, the world is our oyster. We can do whatever we want. So there was a bit of audacity and trying to just believe that you can make something and keep it going.
I was also a barista, so I know you're. Yeah.
One question here. Hi, Chase. Thank you so much for being here. I couldn't help but notice that you had one painting that God is me, and one that God is you. So do you believe that like God is within you, like or a deity or a Buddhist? Or I couldn't help but notice that.
I mean,
I don't want to start something political.
Yeah, no, I'm here for it. Both my grandmas worked in the church for a long time. I grew up with a single mom who was pretty much like the most rebellious, outlandish, outspoken, like, kind of opposite of that. And then for me, I would always kind of negotiate religion and existential thoughts and different religions. And I think for me, that relationship that, specifically in the church, the sound of the music I was really drawn to, but some of the rigidity I think pushed me away. And I started to navigate this idea in all these different religions that I was checking out. The idea of believing in something was so important, and having faith in something was so important, and believing that some of these moral codes or symbols could get you closer to a better tomorrow. And I find that that kind of manifestation language that's kind of shared more ubiquitously now is really important. So for me, this idea that like there's brilliance in the fish in the ocean, there's brilliance in the rock on the shore, there's brilliance in however they invented the engine to get me to the museum from the hotel. Like, all of this is so magical to me. So this idea that you could believe so much in life that you actually start to believe in how you can make life better. So for me, that the notion of God is you and God is us is this idea that, like, your brain and your manifestations and what you set out to believe in is prayer. Your church could be at church, or your church could be at home in your bed when you wake up. Church, for me, is pretty much the shower. It's like 10 minutes of the day, you're in there just like, all right, we're back at it. Like, let's gather the strength and the courage and set your intentions on the day and go forward. And I think, you know, that idea that whatever your religion is or lack of, there's some sort of belief system, there's some sort of faith that's necessary to kind of be that carrot in front of the horse. So for me, it's more of that idea as like God as your brain, as a metaphor of like you believing in what's necessary to get you where you need to go, and that kind of self-catalyzed potential in believing in something, and whatever your something isn't my business. But that idea that you can find that kind of tank of fuel to kind of propel you somewhere was really interesting to me. And I think that they all share that. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Beautiful sentiment. Just I think we only have time for one question left.
Hello?
Yes. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Hey, thank you for coming to Portland to share your paintings and ideas. I had a couple of questions looking at the slides while you were talking. One was the white knees and knuckles and noses, which you addressed. But the other one is, the impression I have of a lot of your figures is with the positive and negative space of woodcuts, and the imagery of woodcuts. And I don't know, how does that work into your work?
Yeah, it's interesting. That has come up a couple times just in the last few years. And I think it's really interesting because African woodcut has similar compositional understanding as the paintings, but I was only privy to that recently. So it's this kind of ancestral spirit or like ancestral take that I really enjoy thinking about. They aren't woodcuts, but I think that there is this idea of positive and negative, that palindrome, that zebra notion that exists in the thinking. And I think that the printmaking process has become really important to me, and I consider it like the exoskeleton of the painting. Like you have to understand the lines, the shapes, the forms to build the composition. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to answer the question other than like I'm starting to see that as well. And I do think that there is like a relationship to, when they were making early printmaking woodcut, you didn't have to go to art school to make it. So maybe there's some similarities of just having a feeling and like, how can I put it on paper and get it out of my head? And maybe that's shared in some of those early, people still make woodcuts, so it's not too early, but in the ones I'm thinking about in my head. But yeah, thank you. Maybe we can have one more question for the guy there.
Yes.
I was in Georgia, and I took a picture of the Thelonious Monk that you had, and it's been on my wall for the last 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
And I was just curious, considering you're a lot younger than I am, that you were into Thelonious Monk, are you inspired by jazz and music and so forth?
Yeah, most definitely. For me, it was like, I always appreciated how both my grandpas were this way. They're very still, very clean. The car never had any crap on the ground. The house was clean. The way they carried themselves, how they dressed, how they spoke, everything had like an incredible intention. And I think today, people wear like graphic t-shirts and sweatsuits, and it's just like changed how we show up in the world. And I think for me, jazz is a great relationship to history and like seeing yourself in a way and imagining a time that intrigues me a lot. I think jazz as this reworking of colonial instruments that came here on a ship and played music that's very different than jazz, that same remix, that same audacity to see a new invention through a historical instrument. I think jazz has a relationship to getting up every day and figuring it out, the way that you can play something different than you did before, the way that it can kind of take you to a place that feels different than where you are at the moment. And I think painting has that similarity. It's this nonlinear time travel, this way that you're kind of always having to remain curious and kind of push things together. So I was drawn to Thelonious when I really started to get into jazz from hearing my grandparents play it, but also just his thumb and fingers smashing the keys in a way that felt so uniquely him, and had an authenticity that was, you could hear it from a mile away and be like, oh, that's that guy. So I think there's so many different relationships to jazz that I'm thinking about in art making, in that idea of like remaining curious and making your mark and making your sound. I often find art has a frequency, and different artists have a kind of genre that they sound like. So I like to kind of imagine like a kind of funk or a kind of jazz or an oldies that I'm interested in, and that kind of history and that kind of bridging of history. So yeah, it really was just an inspiration in so many ways, from history to intellect and brilliance, to also like remixing and reworking a history. So they all kind of existed in a space where it reminded me of like how much is out there, and not like the 15-second catchy song that we all know now, but things that are complicated, things that are hard, things that are making you slow down also have a great benefit to who you are and what you think about. So yeah, thank you for the question, and I'm so happy to hear you saw the SCAD show, and I'm honored you have the picture up on your wall.
Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you to the Nelson.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chase.